Hello, welcome back, y'all. As always, Dr. Nicole Truesdale here, and I'm your host and guide for my podcast, Abolitionist Dreamscape. So welcome. Now, we are at episode 6, y'all, episode 6. And as always, I'm still here, you still here listening, so we still doing this thing called Dreaming Together, okay? So today we're going to talk some more about the ancestors. I'm going to put it in conversation with the concept of ancestry. So thinking about your own personal lineage and what does it mean to kind of engage with your bloodline, whether you know them or not, and how does one go about that when that bloodline might be a little complicated. And I'll give some of my own personal experiences and examples of that as somebody who is a mixed race Black woman who has a complicated relationship with many parts of my lineage, okay? This will also have us talk about the fourth house a bit in astrology, because the fourth house is where we can find our ancestors. It's the bottom of the chart, roots, foundations, and home. So we'll get into that and how we can use the astrology chart to help us with our kind of lineage based veneration practices and how to go about that. And then I'll finally also talk about my relationship to the dead overall and how it was me coming into my practice of Ocha that gave me more guidance on how to engage with ancestral veneration so I could really understand and hear and know my ancestors better. That gave me a lot more context to how I had a relationship with the dead overall since I was a kid. So I'm going to get into that more, all right, for this episode. Now, before we begin, I have to always give the shout outs because I cannot do this work in the public without those who support my work, okay? And so first, my Patreon. I got a Patreon, Abolitionist Dreamscapes, with the same name as this podcast, in which I do a lot of teachings and dreamings and musings about abolition, dreaming through a Black, queer, non-Christian lens, okay? I got a number of different videos there, a number of different articles that talk about various aspects of oppressive systems, how we can understand them, how we break them down, and then also giving astrological kind of musings and forecasts and putting that in conversation with just my own kind of style, okay? And so I want to give a special thank you to all my patrons. I've had a number of folks join recently, and that support means the world to me because, again, it gives me the time and space and, quite frankly, resources to be able to continue to create and dream in the public. I also want to give a shout out to those who continue to support me as they can through donations. I accept donations through my Cash App, Zelle, Venmo, and PayPal. They're all Dr. Nicole Truesdale, and you can find more information about that in the show notes below of how to do so. But again, thank you to all those who continue to support. And again, if you can't financially support, the likes and shares and comments on the various social media platforms that I have. I post my podcasts on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, along with snippets on my TikTok, where I do a lot of teaching in the public, as well as my IG. And so if you can do the likes and shares and comments, that also just gets me into the algorithm, gets me into other people's kind of homes and spaces and places to allow this dreaming in the public. So as always, all of this support greatly helps. And if you are interested in having more kind of intimate conversations with me, I am having it October 15th, a virtual salon conversation, okay, for Black women, queer, and non-binary folks, in which we're going to talk about ancestors, abolition, and astrology, because we're entering into eclipse season. We're going to get this full moon in Aries with a partial lunar eclipse happening September 30th, or 29th to 30th, depending where you are in the world. And so this is going to be marking the beginning of eclipse. And so the fall, as we are about to hit into the kind of fall equinox in the northern hemisphere, the spring equinox in the southern hemisphere, we are really entering into a season of change, a season of tides turning, but also a season in which, because the eclipses are there, it makes the veil very thin, and so the dead are allowed. And so what does justice look like for our ancestors when we can bring that into the now? So we're going to talk about that a lot more in that virtual salon, okay? So go ahead, I'll have in the show notes as well of how to sign up for that. And I also do astrology readings. I do one-on-one coaching. I do facilitation. I do keynote speaking. So you can find all of that and more on my website, drnicoletruesdale.com. You have various ways you can book with me through various booking forums, okay? And so that's about it. Yep, that's about it. Okay, so let's get into it, y'all, all right? Let's talk about the ancestors. Your ancestors, right? That's usually the first question that I'll get from folks. Like, who are my ancestors exactly, and how do I know that they're them? Well, the easiest way to answer that is those who are in your bloodline, right? Who you call kin. Now, that's where it can get a little complicated, because who we call kin, who we consider to be relatives is all dependent upon the society you're in. It's all dependent upon how the society structures its understanding of relationships, right? So it's not going to be the same. And this is why one of the first things I learned in anthropology when I was an undergrad, when I took my first sociocultural anthropology course, one of the professors was a socioculturalist who worked in Papua New Guinea, and her whole kind of foci was on kinship. So I learned them old school kinship charts in undergrad for the whole semester. But it was also fascinating because it really sunk into me that our kinship really is contingent upon who we consider to be in kin with, right? So when you're thinking about your own ancestors, you have to put it in the context of the society you're in and how you have been trained and taught to consider who is and is not kin, right? So that becomes the first location for you to kind of think about who your ancestors are. Now, we also have community ancestors, y'all, too. So it's not just those who we consider part of our bloodline or part of our kinship organizing groups, right? It's also the communities we're in. So there's various layers to this, too. And we hear this a lot when we're in social justice spaces, especially Black organizing spaces, when we call and remember the names of those who came before us, who led these kind of struggles and these fights that we're in the present day. So you'll always hear folks calling Malcolm and Martin. You'll hear folks calling, like Bell Hooks, who have recently passed a couple of years ago, Maya, Audre Lorde. You hear folks calling Ida B. Wells, right? We name kind of streets and monuments and names after community folks or national folks who have left a mark on us in one way, shape, or form. So those do become community ancestors as well that we can kind of collectively call upon in times that we need their guidance and advice and support and energy, okay? So those are ancestors in a really kind of down and dirty way. So when you pull it out and then you ask the question, then what do I do with all that? Like, what do I do with these ancestors, right? You have to remember that part of ancestral veneration is us coming back to a sense of our own humanity so that we can connect to those who were humans before us, who brought us here. So in order to really connect with your ancestors, you got to connect with yourself. You got to connect with your body. You have to be in your body in a way so that you can learn how you yourself communicate with those you cannot see. This is memory. This is the kind of remembering that we come from something else. We are not just here and born to be workers and then die and then pass on that kind of legacy to our offspring, right? We are here to live and hopefully thrive. And so in order to live, you have to be living, which means you need to be in your body. And in that kind of embodiment process, that is what allows us to start that connection. Because again, as I said before in other episodes, our ancestors are us. They are in us. They are literally in our DNA. They make up the materiality that then makes up us. So in order to hear them, in order to connect with them, you got to connect with yourself. And to me, ancestral veneration is a foundational practice that we are coming back into through various ways and in various communities, because it is a calling for us to come back into being human. So to me, ancestral veneration is a complete resistance to the capitalistic system that we are in the spirit of capitalism that has weaponized understandings of our connections to things we cannot see through these kind of various love and light and manifestation type of new age spiritual teachings and gurus that we've been kind of pumped to us for the past few decades, quite frankly. It's really the kind of MLL, the multi-level marketing scheme kind of arena that a lot of these gurus actually do come out of, like Amway and stuff, right? There's a way that to remember who we are, we have to remember where we came from, which means that is allowing us to see that we are more than just workers, that there is a connection outside of us. And when we do that, that then starts to challenge inherently the ways that the spirit of capitalism has settled within us. Because once you start to awaken into your body and start to listen to it and believe it, then you can start to tap in and hear those ancestral musings and kind of aid and help and talk, right? That will then have you start questioning the validity of all of those things you were taught through the spirit of capitalism. So another way to say this is, for me, ancestral veneration is a primary tool in the spiritual warfare that we have all been in since those colonial projects enacted themselves off that European peninsula back in the early 1500s. Okay. And so this is why it's so important right now, and why we're getting so much pushback from organized religions, particularly the Christian church, saying that ancestral veneration is demonic, and they're liking it and saying it's worship. We don't worship our ancestors, y'all. We venerate them. We don't worship them. We remember them. We acknowledge them. We resurrect them from the vestiges of a historical past that is only favored to the power structure, to those who, quote unquote, were successful in this extractive economy, right? So when you go back to your dad, go back to where you came from, there is a way then you go back to a different history, different histories overall. And in that kind of memory, historical making, you then start to really understand and see the lies that we were told about who we are, where we come from, and what our purpose here is. And this is especially important for Black folks in the present day, because it is Black people, Black bodies, right? The construction of Blackness through the white imagination, through the colonial imagination, through the racial capitalist imagination, right? That rendered our bodies down to commodities and disassociated us from those traditional and ancestral practices, therefore trying to remove us from our source of power, because the power lies in us being able to connect to where we come from, to remember who we are, because that is the humanity, y'all. Capitalism is about stealing our humanity and taking it for its personal gain against the spirit, right? It's an extractive one. So if that is the function and purpose of it, and it needs us to be dismembered, literally disempowered, literally disengaged, disassociated, where you push back against this is not always in this kind of physical fight where you're going to be in the front line always. A lot of it is being still and in your body so that you can hear that dead. Okay. Now, one way you can really start to engage with this is thinking about your astrology chart, okay, in the fourth house. So you get an astrology chart done, right? You can go on any kind of basic program online, website, so Astro Charts, Astro Seek, put in your information, you get your chart, okay? I recommend putting it into the whole sign house system. It's just easier to read if you're really not familiar with astrology charts. Then you want to look at the fourth house, which is going to be the very bottom of the chart, and it's going to be the lowest point. That fourth house represents ideas of home, foundations, family, roots, ancestors, ancestry, right? Along with our connection to the kind of depths of our own sense of self. And the 12th house people talk about as the kind of hidden things from ourselves, and the hidden fears and the subconscious, the collective unconscious. And for me, then the fourth house becomes the kind of foundations or the underground, right? The underworld of us in general, right? Our own personal sense of self, because that's what connects us then to our foundation, ancestry, and roots. So you want to look at the house. You want to look at the ruler of the house of your fourth house, okay? So whatever sign is on that house. So for me, I'm a Scorpio rising, which means my fourth house is ruled by Aquarius. Then you also want to look at any placements that are in that house, if you have any planets or any kind of placements at all. And then you want to see what it's aspecting. What that's going to do is kind of give you a sense of any type of quote unquote gifts you may have in communicating that are stronger than others, okay? Those placements in the fourth house can indicate, give you a better indication if you have kind of an elevated or heightened gift or awareness of being able to hear, see, or communicate with the dead, with your dead in particular, okay? So when I look at my astrology chart, right, it really helped me understand why, since I was a kid, I have essentially heard the dead. And I'll be honest, it scared the shit out of me when I was a kid, because it was really palatable and it was always there, especially when I would go to sleep. Every night for years, I would have the same nightmare in which I would go to sleep and I would wake up. And I would have to, my bedroom was like right across the hall from the bathroom. And I would wake up to go to the bathroom and the hallway would be really dark. And so I would tell myself to kind of run really quick and turn the light on because I was scared of the dark. And it was always pitch black. But if I walked out of the bedroom and I happened to look to my left, which would go down the hallway into the main kind of staircase to go down to the front door, I would then be met with some type of figures that would literally come and try to grab me. And it would kind of change sometimes. Sometimes the light would be on and I could walk out and I would look down the stairs, and we had this kind of big old grandfather clock. And if the grandfather clock literally struck 12, then it was like these things from underneath the stairs, literally in the basement, would come and try to grab me. So over the years, I ended up figuring out how to wake myself up in dreams, because I had a lot of those type of dreams, a lot of kind of dreams in which I was going to be taken, or that there was literally kind of entities that I couldn't see. I would call them monsters. And so I would find a mirror in the dream and I would look at it and I would scream, "Wake up, Nicole, wake up, Nicole, wake up, Nicole." And I would force myself to wake up. Now, a lot of times I would wake up back in the dream. So then I taught myself that if I looked in the mirror and I didn't really see a clear reflection, that I was still dreaming. So then that would let me know that I had to keep doing that process of waking myself up until I could get myself into my body again and open my eyes, right? It's kind of exhausting, y'all. So I had a really shit sleep growing up, real shit sleep, okay? But when I look at my astrology chart, I started learning astrology very kind of haphazard in my 20s, and then got more serious with it throughout my 30s, off and on, learning from various folks in various kind of perspectives, until I kind of settled into what I do now, which is Western tropical whole signs astrology. Okay. When I look at my astrology chart, and as I said earlier, the fourth house is a house so we can find our foundations and our roots and where we come from, right? My fourth house is, again, ruled by Aquarius, and it's where my south node is. And my south node is having aspects, literally. And what an aspect means is that there's a conversation happening. I have a trine. So about 3 houses away, my fourth house is trining my 12th house, and it's trining my Venus, Scorpio, my Venus, my Jupiter, and my Saturn that are in a tight conjunction. So literally the house of the foundations, the house of the ancestors, is having a conversation with the house of the subconscious and the underworld and the things we cannot see. So when I say I literally not only hear my ancestors, I hear the dead, I literally hear the dead, right? But what I mean by hearing is it's not that I necessarily am hearing whisperings in my ear, nor do I see things. As a kid, I used to actually see shapes. I saw my sister who had passed in the house. I saw my grandfather who had passed in the house. I had a lot of death also in my actual physical home growing up as a child, which again, fourth house, south node, going to that 12th house means that either in a past life or just in general, there is a way that my home was going to be a space that was going to also have and welcome in death in one way, shape, or form, right? So it's an interesting kind of way for me to re-examine and understand why I had these things. So I didn't necessarily, so as I got older, as I was saying, I didn't necessarily keep seeing things because I said I didn't want to. Like I literally was mostly in my head telling myself that this shit was not real, because it scared the hell out of me. And when I would sometimes talk to my parents about it, not really a whole lot. And when I did talk to them, it didn't really help, because they would literally be like, "Oh yeah, we heard that shit too." I'm like, "What? This is not helping, Mom." My mom and my dad would, let's say that. I remember once my grandfather, my dad's dad, he had passed in the house, and I come back from college. And I had a friend with me for, I think it was like Thanksgiving break or something. And we were downstairs sleeping on the couch. And I remember waking up and seeing my grandfather there, over her, kind of touching her hair. And I was like, I was half asleep. So I said, "Grandpa, what are you doing down here?" And then I was like, "Wait a minute, you dead though. Wait a minute, you dead. You dead. Why are you here?" And like, I remember waking up and then looking at him, looking at me, and then kind of disappearing, right? And I go upstairs and I'm like, "Yo," and my mom is up there. It's the middle of the night too, because she used to work as a trauma burn and ICU nurse at County. So when she didn't work, and she worked overnight, so she didn't sleep either at night. So you can usually find her, she was off in the kitchen cooking some shit, watching TV in the middle of the night, as she was trying to figure out or catch her sleep, right? So I go up there and I'm like, "Mom, I swear to God, I just saw Grandpa Stanley," right? And she was like, "Oh yeah, Nikki, I hear him all the damn time. He'd be up and down them stairs. I don't know why." Excuse me, ma'am? You could at least say something, right? So there was also this weird way in my family growing up that it was also known but never talked about. And then when it was just not dismissed, but not dismissed, just not engaged with, right? And that's honestly also an Aquarius fourth house. Aquarius can be a household, especially depending on the other aspects you have in planets and where they're placed, in which the home is one that did not necessarily know emotional care and did not express emotional care that much. It was much more practical in nature, much more oriented to the kind of overall group. And then you go to the fifth house of Pisces, that kind of a nation, especially if your IC's in the fifth house, which mine is in, that means also that your childhood is also kind of pretty murky. A lot of things don't really make a lot of sense. And it takes a while until you get older, but you have to kind of review those things to really make sense of the kind of nonsense of growing up itself, right? And that really, that's kind of a nice way to describe my childhood, but it really is indicative of how I grew up and why then my relationship to the dead was one that was complicated, quite frankly, because I didn't know what the hell was really going on. But it didn't mean that I still wasn't engaged with the dead, which is really interesting because in my undergrad and then my first master's program, I'm an anthropologist, as I've said before on this podcast, but the first work I did in anthropology was skeletal analysis and forensic work. So I was literally working with dead bodies. There was still for me a connection with the dead, but I had disconnected though from any kind of religious practice because I was deconstructing, whether I didn't really know that's what I was doing. I didn't know the term for it, but I was deconstructing from the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church. So I also grew up in Catholicism from first grade on. I went to Catholic school on the south side suburbs of Chicago. Both my grade school and high school are closed, like the Catholic diocese does. But it was also working or being within the Catholic faith, right? Because of the work with the saints, there's also this weird space in which there is a relationship with the dead as well in that religion, even though it's not necessarily acknowledged that way. But we are literally taught to venerate Jesus, worship Jesus, honestly, and he's an ancestor. Because if Jesus was alive and he had walked this earth at one time, as they claim, right, and he had two parents, that means that he had a lineage, right? And then when he passed over, that means he died, which means he became an ancestor who we're told that rose again from the dead, right? And now we're supposed to literally lay offerings down for him. And the offering is our damn body, right? Body and blood, right? Because supposedly he gave his body and blood for us. So in this kind of construction, even in Catholicism itself, there is space for ancestral veneration. We're just told not to venerate our folks. We're told to venerate their folks, right? So you always got to ask yourself, if it's okay for y'all, but not okay for me, what's really going on? So again, I had these different types of entry points and entry ways for me to engage with the concept of the dead, the concept of death, and therefore that was really the beginning of me understanding the concept of ancestral veneration. But I wasn't really doing it because I didn't necessarily understand it in that way. But I was always talking, right, essentially to spirit. And I wasn't necessarily clear about the spirit I was speaking with, because in my mind, I was speaking essentially either to my higher self, or I was speaking directly to what I considered source, the universe, what we call God, right? Then I became I practiced in Ocha, Lukumi. And it was in this space that ancestral veneration really became central, because in any kind of ATR, African traditional religion, you go through your ancestors first before you get to any primordial. And it was me working with my godfather alongside taking classes through the School of Orisha Studies, and also learning in this magic school I've talked about before with this Haitian Hugan, that the practice of ancestral veneration got really central to my own kind of spiritual practice overall. And then this is when the kind of reawakening in me happened, where I could really hear my dead, my ancestors, my lineage. And then this is when shit got complicated, okay? It's because of who my lineage is. So I am also a mixed race Black woman, okay? I think I've mentioned this before in other episodes too, but my dad's white, my mother is Black. My dad is also second generation American, so his ancestry is straight off of the boat from both Norway, is Norwegian essentially, and also the UK, and it's mostly Scottish descent, English and Scottish descent. So my dad is that kind of northern colonizer, right? mama from the South. She's a Black woman from the South, and ancestral wise, our people actually do come from West Africa, mostly Yoruba and Benin, and then also from the Caribbean and made their way up into the US. So there is a very distinct difference in the cultural backgrounds of my ancestors. Okay. Now, when my dad passed in 2006, it was devastating. I was in first year of my grad school, of my PhD, excuse me, and it wasn't going. It was rough, not the academics, but just socially, honestly. I was in a depressive mode. I didn't really realize it because I was a first year grad student and trying to make the shit work, right? And then my dad literally essentially dropped dead after I talked to him one day when I was at a conference. Now that was in 2006. In 2018, when I started to work with the Haitian Hugon, my dad came down through a divination I was having with him. And in that divination, my dad was acting really erratic. And that's when me and the Hugon realized that he didn't realize that he was actually dead. And so there was a process that I had to do, essentially another burial or another funeral for my dad, so that he understood that it was time for him to not only realize that he was dead, but that he needed to pass over. He needed to, quote unquote, go to the light. When we talk about going to the light, y'all, I know we hear the poltergeist, go to the light, Caroline, right? It's actually pretty accurate in terms of when you do pass over. And again, this is lineage and tradition based for what you believe. And when you do pass over, you do need to face your life. We see this in all kinds of traditions, y'all. We're talking about the scales, talking about, the book of life, the Akashic record. There's different ways that different lineages and cultures talk about it. But overall, there tends to be there tends to be a similarity that once you die, you must face your life. And then in order to do that, you have to essentially review it. And upon that review, you then accept or don't. And then that is what determines if you are kind of crossing over to the other side to sit at the table of those ancestors who are then going to be working with and helping the living here, right? But if you don't do that, then you can essentially be walking dead. You're just dead, but you're not having a space. And so that's when things can get real murky. And when folks can get in trouble when you are working with ancestors and working with entities that have not faced their shit in life, they're not going to face it in death. When you are dead and you can understand and you see more, right? You feel a power you may not have had, especially if you've been marginalized and living. There's a way that then this is when the dead can get a little hairy, and they can be problematic to those that are calling on them when they have not again done their work. So when you are doing your ancestral veneration, it's really important that you are working off the bat with your elevated ancestors, with your elevated dead, those who have done that work, those who have faced themselves, those who have been able to face their humanity or lack thereof, so that when they are now sitting at your council and table and they are dispelling advice for you, that advice is coming out of an elevated understanding of what it means to live and have life in a human body, because the advice they're giving to you is for your highest good, so that you yourself can really engage in and get the most out of this thing we call life, right? But many times that is not how we understand ancestors, nor that's not who we're talking to, especially when you're not trained. And a lot of times this type of work and engagement is one that comes through lineage-based training. You are trained by and learn from those who have been doing this work over time and space. But that all got cut, that all got severed, right, through the colonial projects, through the removal of us from those various types of ancestral practices, the demonization of them, and then the supplementation of that with this kind of spirit of capitalism, right? When we're trying to come back to those spaces and come back to those practices, it goes, again, what I said at the very beginning, coming back to our sense of self, coming back to an embodiment of our bodies, so that when we are trying to work with them, we're really clear about who we're working with and why. Because when you are working with your ancestors and you are getting messages that are not really about you, they're asking you to do things for other people, or they're really kind of chastising and very kind of I've even heard people get really kind of cruel readings from so-called ancestors that are there for their highest good. That is not the point, y'all. There is no point of dying and then coming back to berate those who are living. That is somebody who has not done their work on the other side. So they're relying upon what they knew when they were living, but have not then done the elevated work to then shift that knowledge and shift that kind of understanding of what it means to engage in relationship, engage in struggle, engage in money, whatever you're asking about, right? They're doing so from a more essentially higher space of sight, right? And so all of this is what really has brought me back to a practice of speaking more about what it means to honor our dead and engage with our dead and understand who they are and why we are doing it. It's not to take from them. It's not to tell them that we need X, Y, and Z. And so if you lay some offerings down, that means that they're required then to do that work for you and get that money or enact that revenge. That's not the point. The point of ancestral veneration is to remind ourselves that we are human, and then after this human experience, we will also become ancestors. So what does it mean to be a good ancestor? What does it mean to be a good elevated ancestor so that those who come after you, whether they be your kin or community or a combination of whoever's calling you down, right, you can then help them navigate the terrain that you were also help navigate. And if you didn't get the guidance right, then you understand the importance once you become that elevated ancestor of why we need to continue these practices through space and time. And part of that is learning from those in your own bloodline. But when you are the first to re-engage these practices, right, when you are the first to kind of reawaken them in your lineage, then, okay, then you have to get clear about what your purpose is. And so for me, when I was working with my ancestors, and again, like I said, I have a white line, I got a black line, and make it real simple. When I was working with them and had my dad realize he needed to pass over, the first few ancestors that came out pretty strong in other divinations then that I had with various priests and priestesses of traditions tended to be my white ancestors. They were pretty loud and they made themselves known. They said their name. I found them in my ancestry.com. So it was true. I had one ancestor who was like 10 generations back. She really popped up. Then I also had my great grandma Lily from my mother's side and a few of those ancestors as well. But when they came down real different. They sounded real different and they had much different advice for me. My white ancestors many times were asking me to do things for other people. So do things for my brother, do things for them, asking for specific types of offerings. And then one literally came down into Misa, the one that was 10 generations back, saying that she was upset that she didn't get as much attention as the other ancestors on my altar. And that really not only threw me for a loop, but also pissed me off because I'm like, what are you talking about? I just found out who you were, and you're asking me for tea with 6 damn sugars like we back in colonial England. Oh, wait a minute. You are back in colonial England because that is when you were living, right? And so that's when I started to have to do some interrogation. I was working with other priests and priestesses who were Egun priests. So that's what that means is that they are priests and priestesses of the dead, of our ancestors. So they're specialized in that. And then I started to have to really sit in my body and ask myself, does this even make sense? Does it even feel good? Because like I didn't come to the altar to get told to do more work. I came to the altar to lay my burdens down and ask how to connect with y'all because this shit wasn't working in the living. And you're telling me that it's my job to keep making it work. It didn't make any sense. But then my great grandma Lily started coming through and I saw that there was a big difference in the messages because she was about me and my life. And her and the rest of the kind of more elevated Black ancestors were really about asking me, what do you want, Nikki? How do you want it and why? And what happens if you actually allowed yourself some damn joy? Right? What happens if you allowed yourself the ability to question why other people are always asking you to do stuff for them, but yet you have no kind of energy for you, right? That really helped me see a number of things, but one of them was that I had to cut off my white ancestors because they were taking from me. They were not helping me. And quite frankly, was no different than my father when he was living. And it's not about speaking ill of the dead. He was a stay-at-home dad. My mom worked. It was a very complicated household, complicated relationship. But at the end of the day, my dad was never there for me. From horrendous racial violence that I suffered in schools and him doing nothing, to him also, quite frankly, being a functioning alcoholic, which had me grow up very quickly and then having to essentially help run a household as a kid because I was the oldest of five, right? To then literally having to figure out everything in my life, school, how to fund it, what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to go, right? I realized that in living, that line did nothing for me but took from me. So in death, why would I expect anything different until I did something different? Right? Because when you are an ancestor and you are human and you used to live on this earth, y'all, that means that you used to be human. And humans are complicated, messy motherfuckers, right? Which means that if they weren't ain't shit in life, they may also be ain't shit in death if they have not done that work to face themselves and go up. So when I get a lot of folks asking me, I'm mixed, who do I go with? Like, who do I do both, right? That's going to be an individual case, y'all, but you're going to have to believe what your ancestors are telling you or not telling you, okay? And if a part of your lineage or line wasn't helpful in life, then there may be a way that may not be helpful in death. So you got to go further back. You got to go to those elevated ancestors. You got to go to those who have done that work, who just may not have been able to be heard, because those who are the walking dead, those ancestors who have not crossed over, can tend to be a hell of a lot louder when you are getting divination from diviners who may not be as sound or trained to be able to discern who they are communing with. So I always tell folks, if you are going to a diviner, I don't care what divination service it is and what system it is, you need to make it very clear to that person that you only want to speak with your elevated ancestors. And for me, if I go to somebody who is not familiar to me, right, I don't do this very often, but if I need a reading or if I need some divination and I'm going to somebody, I make it very clear I only work with my elevated ancestors on my mother's line. And then the other primordials and spirit guides that are part of my court. Okay. And that took a few years of a lot of trial and error, a lot of me doing what I was told. Because again, this is the obedience thing that we are beaten into. If you come out of these kind of Abrahamic traditions, that translates over, if you're not careful, into other spaces, right? So I was doing what I was told. And quite frankly, my godfather is not an Egun priest. He's a Babalawo. So when my father was coming down along with the other ancestors, right, he was just relaying the information to me, but he himself was not discerning. And this is where patriarchy comes in, because here is my father coming down dead, right, in a ceremony before I'm getting or receiving something else, saying that my job and duty is to take care of my brothers as another man, right, who also frames a lot of the type of messages through that lens. Then the interpretation I got back was essentially for me to continue to be of service. Until my grandmother came through, great grandma Lily, she came through real loud after that and was like, we ain't doing this. And she came down hard and loud. And that kind of shook me, but also shook my godfather, quite frankly. And that is what allowed me to really get clearer about what it is I needed, right? But I needed in the living, so that when I'm going to my dead, I'm clearer about why I'm going to them. And at that time, I'll be honest, y'all, I needed freedom. I needed help. I needed something to break. I didn't even know what that was, but I just needed something to break because I was breaking. And so this is where, when I made that decision to cut off my white line, because they really were taking from me still in death, and focusing on those ancestors who were really for me here, that's when shit opened up. And I don't mean open up in terms of, roses coming down from the sky and money flowing. What I mean opened up was me. And that's a lot of the kind of kicking off of other things I talked about on this podcast, about coming out, about leaving higher ed, all that stuff, right, really was an issue and things that are coming up for me and that I was able to wade through, and also with me getting clearer about who I was venerating and why. And it was, for me, my elevated Black bloodline, who was also working then with the Orisha, who walk with me, and my spirit guides, okay? And so This is why I talk about it on the present day. This is why I'm having the virtual conversation for Black, queer, non-binary folks, so that we understand the purpose and point of these practices and don't reduce it down to another capitalistic, I give you this, you give me back. This is really about getting us back into a relationship with ourselves so that we can get into a relationship with our humanity, so that when we do pass over, we can become those elevated ancestors to help the future generations go forward to enact a human understanding of being versus the capitalistic one that is now breaking. Okay. I'm going to stop there. Let me know what you think in the show notes or in the comments below, I should say. All right, next time I'm back, it's going to be October, and October is Hoodoo Heritage Month. So we're going to continue talking about ancestors in various ways. I'll bring in some hoodoo because when I was working with that in the magic school with that Haitian Hugon, one of my colleagues was actually a hoodoo priestess, and me and her did a lot of things together. So I'll talk about that and focus on this idea of protection. What does it mean to protect ourselves, especially in the current present day, as we're seeing these kind of systems collapse? We're seeing the people who bought into these systems being exposed with all these celebrities. And we also know that we're going to be entering into a time of essentially upheaval as we're figuring out what's next. So how do we protect ourselves in this, right? I'm going to talk about that through a hoodoo lens as we enter into October, okay? All right, that's all I got for now. Remember, y'all, keep dreaming, keep imagining, because it's through our dreamscapes that we can actually figure out what freedom is. Till next time.